Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Nice to see everybody after Pesach. We'll begin with Parshas Acharei, chapter 16, verse 1. Chapter 16, verse 1. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Acharei Moshe bnei Aaron. God said to Moshe after the passing of the two sons of Aaron, V'karvasam l'fnei Hashem vayamusu, as when they brought something before God and they died. Of course, that's a reference to Nadav ben Avihu. Verse 2, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hashem said to Moshe, Daber el Aharon Achicha, speak to Aaron your brother. Val Yavov v'choleis al HaKodesh m'beis laparoches. He cannot just go in to the sacred area of the Mishkan just at any time. Pnei HaKapores asher al ha'aron v'lo yamus ki be'anon eireh la kapores. The cloud appears over the Kapores, and that's not so. Aaron HaKohen cannot just go into the most sacred area of the Mishkan, and when he goes in, it would be on Yom Kippur, and that's the context. Why does it say in the pasuk that God said this to Moshe after Aaron's sons died? Why is that relevant here? Is it because the Torah wants me to know when on the timeline it was? Is it because the message is fundamentally connected to the passing of the sons of Aaron? Just a very basic question, just kind of jumps out at you. The Rambam on Pasuk Aleph. Tam Acharei Moshe bnei Aaron. Ki miyad kasher meisu banav hiziras Aaron min hayayin u'min hashechar shelo yamus. So immediately after the passing of Nadav ben Avihu, and this is something we discussed at the time, measuring time as before Pesach, a few weeks before Pesach, we in the parsha that discussed the passing of Nadav ben Avihu, right after they passed away, there was a directive to Aaron that people, the Kohanim, may not come and serve after having drunk wine. And there, if you remember, it's one of the classic sources, one of the classic reasons for the idea that suggests that the sin of Nadav ben Avihu had been that they had something to drink before going in to serve. So actually, so the first chapter Ramban says is, he says, listen, so actually, this was another directive conveyed relatively soon after the passing of Nadav ben Avihu. The first directive had been that when the Kohanim go in, they may not have had anything to drink. And the second directive is be diligent. Oh, there's a certain area you can only go into on Yom Kippur. Va'karov shayushtei mitzvos elu biyom hamacharas l'misasam. So the Ramban says, I think the real pshat here is that both of those instructions occurred the day after the deaths of Nadav ben Avihu. Kivo vayom onein haya ve'ein ruach hakodesh shoreh mitoch atzvos. Just a very interesting thing to think about when we say that Aaron received these instructions after the passing of Nadav ben Avihu. How soon is after? So he says, well, it's logical to say it was the next day, because the day that they passed, Aaron had status as an oning. That's the halachic status immediately after a loved one passes away. And we know that the Torah recognizes the great feeling of sorrow immediately after a loved one passes. And there's a famous idea that the divine presence doesn't dwell on a person when they're in a state of great sadness. So says the Ramban, it makes sense to say that these instructions were made to Aaron the day after the sons passed away. An interesting thing to think about. And the instruction in terms of wine actually was specifically to Aaron. Also, hayom haisagam zos hamitzvah l'Moshe. But hiktim akasav asharosh shehizir esisrael shleim musa b'tum asam b'tamam mishkanei asher b'socham v'acharei kein kasav asharas hayachid. So the obvious question is, if this instruction was given after the passing of Nadav ben Avihu, just like the instruction of them not having anything to drink was given after the passing of Nadav ben Avihu, what took so long? There literally are two parshios in between the passing, more than two parshios, in between the passing of Nadav ben Avihu and the beginning of this parsha. And the instruction about not having wine to drink was right after Nadav ben Avihu passed. So the Ramban explains, well, there was another idea that God wanted to convey to the Kohanim in general, which had to do with Kohanim not coming into the Mishkan if they were ritually impure. And the discussion of being ritually impure led to the discussion about Tsaras. And now we're kind of getting back on tack. So the Ramban says it's also sort of one logical flow. V'aldati kol Torah kaseder. And the Ramban says, I think all of this is written in a very orderly way. Shekol hamakomos asher bohem. I'm sorry. He says, my opinion is that in general, the Torah is written in order. Shekol hamakomos asher bohem ya'acher hamukdam yifaresh bo kagon vaydaber Hashem el Moshe b'har Sinai b'sefer hazeh kagon vayhi b'yom kalos Moshe lo kibas hamishkan b'sefer Hashenu kiyotze b'hen. The Ramban says, and this is a famous opinion of the Ramban. There's a lot of discussion about this among the Rishonim. We have a concept in the Gemara in Muktam Mukhar Torah. The Torah is not written in chronological order, or for all those who either had Rabbi Zucker or had children who had Rabbi Zucker in the Hebrew Academy in fourth grade. The Torah is not a storybook, right? That was a very famous Rabbi Zucker quote. But in any event, the Ramban says, how do we reconcile the idea of a Muktam Mukhar Torah with general impressions of things being written in order? I mean, presumably we would assume things are written in order. Should we assume that everything that follows something else is no time connection? So the Ramban says, no, here's the assumption. The assumption is that everything's written in order. Every now and then, the Torah specifically labels something as out of order. Every now and then, the Torah gives a specific date that if you're paying attention to the dates, it's very evident that we just backtracked. But so that, says the Ramban, is what the Gemara means when it says in Muktam Mukhar Torah, that there's such a thing as backtracking. But when the Torah backtracks, it tells me specifically that it backtracked. So says the Ramban, L'kach Omer Bekan Acharei Mos Lodia Ki Hayazeh Acharei Mosa Miyad. So the Ramban says, you know why it says after the sons of Aaron passed away? Because the Torah is trying to help me understand when this was said. Because it's far from evident that this was said right after the sons of Aaron passed away, because there's all these parshas in between. But, says the Ramban, that's why the Torah says it's after the passing of the sons of Aaron, to make me understand that the timeline was right back there like in Parsha Shmini. The Torah didn't introduce this halacha then, because there were other logical things to convey. But when it was said, it was right after their passing. Yet Tamakas v'Shem Hashem l'Moshe b'Lashon Hazeh Acharei shemesu shnei bnei Aaron v'Karvasom v'nei Hashem Emrei Love Shlo Yava v'Chol Eisel HaKodesh v'Lo Yamus. And then there's another pshat which is cited by Rashi, which is that it's a way of cautioning Aaron, that Aaron should understand that Nadav and Avihu died because they didn't exhibit the proper caution when being in the Mishkan, and he should have that in mind. And with that in mind, he should observe these restrictions that are conveyed in this parsha. So it's not that the message was conveyed right after Nadav and Avihu passed away. No, it's not a timeline thing, but it's just a reminder when you convey this message to him, be it with the understanding that his sons died and we don't want the same thing to happen to him. That's the other shot that the Ramban cites over here. Okay, let's go on to verse 4. We are describing how Aaron should look on Yom Kippur. Ksones bad kodesh yilbash. He should wear this holy tunic. Umichnaseivad yu al b'saro. He should have pants on his flesh. This is all linen. All these garments are made of linen. Whether it be the hat, the tunic, the pants. Big Day Kodesh Haim, these are garments of sanctity. V'rachatz b'mayim es b'saro ulveisham. And he should immerse himself in the mikvah and then put on these sacred garments. What is meant by referring to them as sacred garments? Presumably we understand that these should not just be something he gets off the rack at Sims or whatever. I mean, presumably there's a unique status here. Why does he have to say Big Day Kodesh? And presumably we understand he can't use these for other things. Sforno on Pasuk Daled, Big Day Kodesh, Bikamosam, Yero hamalachim el hanavim. Kihem nirim uz bilvushe abadim. Really interesting idea from the Sforno. Sforno says, there are prophets that have images with angels. How do the angels look in these prophecies? The garments, and this is that. So the Sforno says the white garments that Aaron wears on Yom Kippur, that's another set of garments as well, but the white garments that Aaron wears on Yom Kippur are akin to the garments the angels wear in the prophetic visions. It's a very interesting idea. Whether or not we can wrap our mind around this, certainly not everyone agrees to this, but he says that's the pshat in Big Day Kodesh, clothing of sanctity. An interesting thing to think about. Okay, let's go on to verse 8. And this is one of the most famous aspects of the Yom Kippur service, and one of the most confusing things, difficult to understand things conveyed in the entire Torah, I think. So Aaron has already brought an offering, and now in verse 7 it says, Aaron should take 2 goats, and stand them before God at the opening tent of meeting. Verse 8, there should be 2 lots, one for each goat. Gorol echad laHashem, gorol echad laAzazel. One lot should be designated to be brought as an offering to God, and one lot should be laAzazel, for lack of a particularly good translation. The basic idea is to the powers of evil, something like that, difficult to understand. So we're going to bring one animal for God, one animal for evil. Verse 9, and the lot that gets the goat that gets the lot of to God should be brought as a sin offering. Verse 10, and we will send the other goat to Azazel in the desert. What is going on with this? We appreciate the imagery of 2 goats, and there's a lot of discussion. I'm sure many of you have heard before. The goats are supposed to be more or less identical, and so these great drushes about, there are two things, 2 people that seem identical, but one of them is devoted to God and one of them isn't. Amazing, beautiful ideas. But what in the world is happening to the other goat? What is this? We're sending it off to the desert. What's this all about? So let's at least start the Ramban on Pasuk Ches. Actually, I see it's already 9:45, so we are not going to start the Ramban on Pasuk Ches, but God willing, we'll start with the Ramban tomorrow. So we discussed ideas in the Ramban as to why the Pasuk introduces the idea of Aaron not freely going into the most sacred area of the Mishkan except on Yom Kippur, why it specifically introduced it as after the death of the sons of Aaron. We discussed the Sforno as to why the garments of Aaron on Yom Kippur are referred to as garments of sanctity.